Anthony, my man, thank you so much for coming on today. Super excited to have you on and chat with you. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing, Mike. First and foremost, I'm just honored to be on this. I've kind of fanboying out right now because, it's been something where as long as I've been in this profession, I've been listening to you and your work. So it kind of feels like getting called up on stage to play drum with the Red Hot Chili Peppers right now. So
yes, let's go.
So I'm pumped about that. But no, I'm a physical therapist, strength conditioning coach, currently working in Washington, D.C. with the Washington Wizards. Just finished my second season with the team. Prior to that was a clinic director for a clinic called Rehab to Reform. So I've been a physical therapist for, I think I just hit 6 years. I've been a strength conditioning coach for about 10. So I've really just been trying to blend those two worlds and get better every day here working in DC.
I love it. So talk to me. I love getting people's backstory. What led you to the world of physical preparation? What got you started in all this?
So my story is so average with every other strength coach you listen to, below average, underpowered athlete, found the weight room and, found a glimmer of hope for his career.
Right.
And then in the meantime, fell in love with, human body anatomy, physiology, and putting pieces together. But for me, a big piece was I just very clearly remember this transition as an athlete, as my primary sport was soccer, where my focus became less of my own development and more of the team dynamic. And it kind of, before I ended up playing, I was I think I want to coach. Mm-hmm. And then, in school, I was definitely gravitating towards biology and anatomy and those types of things. So those two worlds seemed to come together. And I really remember finishing high school and becoming obsessed with this thought of working for the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So you remember those commercials where those dudes were just crushing VO2 max tests and just
yes,
dripping out lemon lime Gatorade out of their foreheads and the person, the lab coach, just scribbling vicious notes. I wanted to be that person in the lab coach, right? So I just got really excited about anything that affected human performance and thought it was going to be more of that ex-phys route. And lo and behold, after my first chemistry lab in school, I figured out that I was not meant to be the guy in the lab coat, and I was meant to be the guy in the gym. So I got more involved in the fitness side of things, teaching group fitness, CrossFit when I was early in undergrad, and then hurt myself 7 too many times in the weight room doing stupid stuff, and started asking questions about is this really the best way for me to train? And that kind of stuff led me to, Mike Boyle's work, led me to Aaron Bill's work, led me to find that, guys like Anthony Donskov happened to have a gym 10 minutes from where I grew up, and landed an internship there. Started working in the weight room as a student assistant at University of Dayton with our D1 program for the remainder of my college time there. And then went intern at Boyle's, and then kind of was full head of steam forward to be a strength conditioning coach. I wanted to be in the collegiate setting, so I was looking at GAs. And then really towards the end of my time in undergrad, I started kind of getting the rehab bug. I started realizing a lot of my time and attention was focused there. So I decided to kind of put my chips on the table for kind of one big dream school, GA. And I decided, hey, if I don't get this, I'm gonna head to PT school. And ended up, they took 2 people. I ended up being third on the list for the GA spot. So it couldn't have worked out better because that pushed me to where I am now. And I think, if I wouldn't have gone the PT route, I would have had an itch I couldn't scratch. But So along that path too, I was kind of getting ready. I had to take a year gap to get my hours and everything for school, and got a call from a minor league baseball team as well to looking for strength conditioning coach. So I went out to spring training for a week and was loving life out there. I was you know what? I don't think I'm ready for school. I really don't want to sit in a classroom. I think I want to do this. So some people talked me off that, just saying, be patient, go to school. And,
right.
I was smart enough to reach out to a lot of my mentors and people I respect in the field, and actually cold called a lot of people I didn't know but respected. And everyone was hey man, just suck it up and go to school. So
right.
I was not loving that advice when I was sitting in wound care class during the summer, when I thought I should have been on riding the bus with the team and spitting sunflower seeds, but it paid dividends in the end.
So walk us from that point forward. Obviously pretty cool gig now with the Washington Wizards. Walk us through PT school to where you're at now. Give us the career path, because you're in a pretty cool position, right? And a lot of young coaches probably listening in are oh man, I want to be in the NBA. I'm going to get in the league. So talk to me about those steps, because everybody thinks it's just yo, I'm going to do an internship and then I'm going to be in the league. And it doesn't always work quite like that.
Yeah, I think, and I tell a lot of younger coach or therapist who will listen, like I think the foundation comes in coaching. Like that's something you can do without the degree. That's something you can do without the license, to really start early and get your hands on with people, get experience coaching, cueing, because that's really the bedrock and foundation of what we do. And I think secondarily, like as you're doing that, you're starting your career and you're building a network. You're understanding what you like, what you don't like, what resonates you, what doesn't. And you're finding the people who are kind of innovating and pushing. So for me, it honestly came down to like, I think initially from when I started the field it was starting with a question, like, why am I hurting myself and how do I get better? How do I train better? And that just kept leading to more and more questions, kept leading to people that were asking and answering good questions. So I think you just kind of chase that rabbit hole and you end up kind of finding yourself in, room after room with people who are a lot smarter than you and are just as curious as you. And I feel like good stuff happens from there. So I was lucky to kind of end up in some rooms with, you and Bill and the team at iFast, and was able to kind of work out some times to observe with Bill, and then eventually come into a 4-week rotation with him and hang with you in the Indy 11 as well. And just, I think if you make that decision to be around people like that, you really leave yourself no choice but to be great. Like, cause you can't unless you stay in that room. Right. Yes. So for me, it's continuing to try to keep putting myself in those rooms, keep putting myself in places where I, feel overwhelmed and feel like I'm, the dumbest person in the room. And that's kind of I think that's the periodization of a career right there, is to continue to find ways to be uncomfortable. So that's really it's just a series of doing that over and over again, from school, finding clinical rotations that were going to challenge my thinking process, that were going to put me in positions to kind of take a next step. So I try to curate that stuff out, and I luckily ended up at, Rehab to Perform, which became a really big foundation for me, and led me to move out to the DC area. And then got to spend some time with you guys, and then got to spend some time out in Arizona with the mayor himself, Connor Ryan. So,
dude, true OG right there, man. Connor Ryan.
100%. So I think, like, I said, you're kind of the average of the people that you assimilate with. And, I'm just very thankful and honored to kind of have been around those types of people. So really what that did is it put me in a situation, I think, out of school where I was able to have a system to, to understand how to learn. I think that's the biggest thing, because you walk into your career and you're going to get so many different data points, and you're going to get busy because the field of physical therapy or coaching it's production based. Like, you have to see people, you got to put the hours in. But if you start doing that without a foundation of how to learn and how to audit yourself or how to think, it can quickly become really noisy and stunt growth. So I think having that prior to getting the, 14, 15 patients a day for, 5 days a week rhythm, allows for good growth. So really in that realm, like as I got in the clinic, like I kept trying to, continue networking, continue to find ways to push myself, courses, ways to just continue answering questions for the patients in front of me. Ended up getting linked up with there's the best high school track and field program in the country happened to be right near our clinic in Potomac, Maryland, Bullis school. And they're putting out some amazing sprinters. So I ended up getting linked up with them, and got a chance to go kind of be a performance therapist consultant with them. Additionally, kind of join their coaching staff to help integrate some stuff we were doing in the clinic and trackside. So that was really my jump from the clinic to integrating things in a team sports setting, which I just absolutely loved, because it took me from, outpatient clinic work. Getting those repetitions is excellent, but being able to take that outside the clinic walls and see how that affects somebody on a race day, seeing those team dynamics, seeing the psychology of, someone having to step up to the starting line after you just rehab their hamstring strain, and understanding those dynamics, I think really pushed me to continue learning more and continue asking better questions and make myself a more well-rounded clinician. Additionally, just spending time around track and field coaches, really up my game, because they're absolutely brilliant without knowing how brilliant they are, just because they're having to do this stuff every day. So I think it was a really good symbiotic process for all of us at the school, and kids, coaches, myself included, and just had a great time. From there, honestly, just I think right place, right time, right opportunity for an opportunity opening up with the Wizards, and happened to meet the right people at the right time, happened to be a job opening, and happened to be fortunate to put myself in a position where I was the right person to step in. So it's one of those things where you just feel like you won the lottery because, typically you're having to move yourself across the country for these jobs. You're having to sacrifice a lot. And I got to, now I'm living in DC, and my wife works downtown, and we got to, I can take the metro to the arena. So it's something where I feel just extremely, extremely fortunate to have that opportunity. Yeah. Additionally, I walked into a staff with the Wizards that's just like amazing. Like they're just straight certified killers on this, both on the strength and the medical side and on the coaching side. So for me, it's something where just you feel your rate of growth. I think, as a coach or clinician, you feel yourself as, when you start out, it's just like in the weight room, you're going to have those kind of linear periodization gains where everything works, right? And then you start seeing like you need a new stimulus, a new challenge. And this has kind of just led to like what feels like a tangential rise for me as far as learning. So I'm just thankful that this hit me at the right time and be put in this situation. Yeah,
I love it. Well, I wrote down two things. I don't want to get too tangential right off the bat, but two things you said really stood out. Sorry. Number one was this idea of having a foundation first. And one thing that's been interesting, I know you came through the IFAST walls, but one of the cool things about people that intern at IFAST is a lot of them wanted to go on and then intern at Cressy. And I think one of the best things about that was I said, I think that's the best way to do it, right? Because we're a smaller environment, right? We've got 3 or 4 in a group. Obviously, that's a much bigger environment, bigger, populations of people in the gym at one time. So I said, hey, look, this is the best thing for you to do is to do it in this order, right? Because you're going to get a foundation from us to build from, and then you're going to go there and you're just going to get an unlimited amount of reps. And so it's been cool to see those former interns that started with us and then went there and see their growth. So I think that's huge. You got to have the foundation first, because otherwise you're going to drown, right? Like you alluded to, if you don't have a good foundation, you're seeing 15, 16 patients a day, probably not going to be successful. And then second, I love this, and I would recommend all strength coaches at some point in time get around a stopwatch sport like track, like powerlifting, like Olympic weightlifting, because look, man, let's be real here. And I don't know Alabama's football's strength and conditioning coach. So if this gets back to him somehow, I'm not throwing shade. All I'm saying is if I've got Alabama's football team, I'm going to look pretty good as their strength coach because they're pretty damn good football players. But you learn really quick about how good of a strength coach you are when you're working with stopwatch sports athletes, because it's very clear, are they getting better or are they not? And what role are you playing in that? So those are just two things that really stood out, is have a foundation, and as a strength coach, get around a stopwatch sport, because you will learn very quickly whether you're being successful and having an impact or not.
100%. The more constrained it is, you can't hide. So
yeah,
your
it's a good way to put it.
For good or for bad.
You cannot hide.
And additionally, those sports seem to be like I kind of think of those as like, they're typically your like pure force production sports. So like,
yes.
If we're talking about weightlifting and track, so it's like, those are kind of like your ABCs of athleticism, right? So it kind of strips away like, so I think of that. I mean, I'm working with basketball players and the court's limited to where we don't you really don't get up to top speed, but I'm thinking about sprint mechanics. I'm thinking about those types of things, and those play, credence in everything we do from a rehab process and performance process. So it's foundational. It's always going to follow you.
I love it. Well, this kind of goes seamlessly into my first question, because you and I discussed this. I want to kind of start broad and just get some foundational overarching views, and then I want to drill down into some specific topics. But for starters, I would just love to hear, as a physical therapist, what are your foundational principles or your big rocks when it comes to return to play?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some general, I guess, quote unquote, like meta principles that guide me when I think through this. So like one is, it's kind of in vogue right now to say reverse engineering, but I think it's a good concept, right? I think it's a really good concept. Like if you don't understand where you're going and don't understand what the terminal task is, like it's hard to understand where to begin. So I think it's a problem in the physical therapy industry for sure, where there seems to be a lack of understanding for the true demands of sport. Like I said, if like you're constrained to your clinic walls, it's hard to understand what that actually looks like outside. It's hard to understand what troubles they're going to run into. And I think for me, being on the court every single day, it's even clearer how much I feel like I was missing in the clinic. Mm-hmm. And again, like that's not to knock, obviously there's much I'm missing from not being in the clinic because the environment's different. So there's positives and negatives to every environment. But for me, I think the advice I give is like, hey, you got to spend some of your time going and volunteering at practice, going and hanging around a field sport to understand the context of it. Like as a former athlete, you understand some of it, but you got to come back and see it again with fresh clinical eyes, because it's going to come off different to you now. So I think spending that time talking to coaches, understanding what the limitations are, what things can be manipulated on field to better interpret the terminal task as they get closer to return to play. Those are all the things that I think really, really matter, that we might not be able to directly manipulate in our gym or clinic, but need to be addressed to have a thorough process. Second thing is attacking rate limiting variables. So I think of this like a chemistry equation. Like when you break that down, like there's always going to be kind of a rate limiting step within the equation that you need to go through this step first, then it catalyzes the next thing to move forward. So in our rehab processes, like if we're skipping steps or we're missing the rate limiting variable, we may not be attacking like the lowest hanging fruit, or the thing that's going to kick off a domino effect of things moving forward. So I think taking that time to really pull back and understand what are the layers here, and really what are the constraints that are affecting this individual, and where do I need to be to begin to influence the system most broadly. That's certainly an important concept. I think another one is, especially in the long-term rehab world, is finding the silver lining in the process. So I think that's important psychologically, especially working with athletes where this is their paycheck, and even not even paycheck for a lot of people not getting paid for this. It's still it's identity, it's social outlets, it's everything. So really you start looking at people that might go 23, 24 years never having a major injury, and now they're left to what am I doing with myself? How do I find purpose and meaning here? So I think taking that from a tactical lens, it's, hey, you've never had an off season in how long? You've never had this period of time where you haven't had the competing demand of sport. So rather than, thinking about what we're missing out on, what does this afford us? What opportunities do we have to attack certain things that you haven't had? How is this time investment going to support the rest of your career? How can we learn from this process that is going to allow you to avoid another problem that might pop up in 2 to 3 years? So I'm constantly trying to talk to our athletes about that, and understanding, how to make the most out of this process, how to make it meaningful, and how to build something where we're not just addressing the constraints from the injury, but we're addressing bigger picture issues that might be behind them, or finding other tactical solutions to things that they might run into in the future. So I think it's a huge opportunity for us, for sure. The last meta principle I think about is N=1 context with N=10,000 insight. So what I mean by that is we need to understand the long-term context of the individual within a large framework of data. So there's I believe Australian sports scientist Dr. Sophia Nymphius, and she's I want to tattoo this quote on my forehead. I probably reference this so much, but she says we can reduce the effect of our biases by combining a large scale understanding of averages with the long-term lens of a single athlete. For me, that really defines, I think, and it's really going to interlace a lot of any discussion we have on return to play processes or data or anything like that, because that's really what it comes down to. Is at the end of the day, we can get caught up in what we expect to be based off of, large scale averages. But at the end of the day, the person in front of you is not the average. It's an N=1 case study that you have to be able to look at, individual factors. But again, understand how, common things happen commonly. So there is going to be context there.
Yep. And go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And then I would say from just a generally tactical principle standpoint, if we start breaking down the things that, when we start thinking about how do I organize a rehab process, or how do we organize testing, there's a couple of different principles that I'll look at. And those are really just understanding, we want to make sure we're, addressing movement variability, movement options available to the individual, how they're coordinating those movement options. I want to make sure we're looking at elements of force production. I want to make sure we're looking at energy production. I want to make sure we're addressing graded exposure to the tissue and graded exposure to the terminal task for the individual. And then we want to address the psychological elements, so self-efficacy, beliefs within that stuff. So I paint that out because if we start talking about, or when you start talking about your KPIs, your key performance indicators, your tests, those different principles will interlace. Each one of those things should have a test underneath it. Each one of the things should have a metric that I'm tracking, because whether it's a 88-year-old grandma or a elite NBA basketball player, those things we listed are going to matter.
Sure. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about assessing risk in return to play, because I don't know whether you allude to it or not, like everybody kind of knows we have this ever increasing amount of data and tools that we can pull from, right? It's like limitless now. But I'm interested because you probably have more tools and data than most. So what metrics really matter to you, right? Like what metrics are you like, no, these have to be an important piece of assessing risk with the athletes that I'm working with?
Yeah, I love that question because like it's fresh enough that I made this transition from, outpatient to pro sports, where I just remember stepping in and it was like, every time I'm in the clinic, like, man, I wish I had this. I wish I had force plates. I wish I had this because it would, and then I walk into, like a kid in a candy store to this environment where you have everything. You have all these things. And then it's like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with it? How do I sense make out of it? So at the end of the day, I think there's a couple things. Like the data is only as good as your framework is. And then secondarily, the data should be a servant, not the master.
I like that.
So you have to have a solid foundation of understanding what you actually need to, what you want to see and what you're going to do with that data before you can start implementing. Otherwise, it creates a massive amount of noise.
Sure.
So when we start looking at data, I think some of the common flaws and things and mistakes I've made is like you're expecting it to like kind of spit out answers for you and tell you what to do. Like you're expecting this kind of chat GPT thing to tell you, oh, this person's not ready or they are ready, right? And like It's just we're not there. It's not there yet, and that's taking away a lot of the art and even more integrated science of what we do. It's a piece of the puzzle. So when we start assessing risk, like there's not going to be any one test or really any, battery of tests that give us any sort of certainty. All we're trying to do is we're trying to manage probabilities here. So when I start thinking about assessing risk, I think one important concept is to think about like, we're not really trying to identify individual risk factors. We're more so looking at injury pattern recognition. So it comes back to that long-term lens of the single athlete thing I brought up before, right?
Yep.
So we might understand that there's different large scale data showing us there's different risk factors for certain injuries or different populations. However, how does this affect the long-term story of the individual in front of you? So I really like this concept of like complex web of determinants. There's a really good article by, I believe it's Bittencourt et al. That's like complex systems approach to sports injury, I believe the article is. And what he lays out there is this concept of, like I said, this web of determinants where we're looking at these emerging patterns, like injury occurs, and then he has this graphic in there where it's a bunch of like bubbles. So it might be like anthropometrics, it might be ankle dorsiflexion, it might be muscle strength, it might be, acute chronic workload. And each of these things has a bubble attributed to it. Some of the bubbles are small and some of the bubbles are much bigger and bold. So it's our job as a clinician to identify what are all those bubbles for the large scale group. Mm-hmm. What are those bubbles, and which of those bubbles now are larger and bolder for the individual in front of me? So we're kind of trying to put together a story of, this person has had multiple ankle sprains and now they hurt the contralateral hamstring. Like, well, how is this stuff implicated? How is this injury pattern? What story is this telling me? And how does this equate with the strategy that the individual is expressing in front of me? And based off this strategy, is this efficient? Is this sustainable? Is this aligned with what's being asked, the demands that are being asked of the athlete? Is this efficient? And we need to be able to look at that and try to make sense of that in order to make the most nuanced decision for that individual in front of you.
So talk to me, because a lot of times I always try and put myself in the listener's seat, right? And so somebody's probably listening to this and like, well, this is great, Anthony. You work for the Wizards. You've got all the tools, all the tech. So with that being said, how do you improve return to play decision making using data? But maybe on the flip side of that, how do you improve your decision making without some of the data that you might have access to?
That's a great question. So again, like I feel like I just kind of like downplayed data, but it is important. Like we do utilize it, and like I said, it's an enhancer inside of a well constructed process. So I would say like we're always using data, I think, as clinicians and coaches, whether you know it or not. That data may be your coach's eye. That data may be the feedback from the individual.
Yep.
That data may be force plates. It may be GPS units, right? So all that stuff is data coming in. And I think regardless of whether it's high tech or low tech, if it's, something that looks really cool and shiny, or if it's just something you build over time, like that stuff's valuable. But again, it needs to be, weighted differently based off of, what does literature say? What is your experience level? What is your level of pattern recognition as a coach?
Right.
Like I trust Dan Paff's eye watching sprinters way more than I trust myself, because he's earned that. He's earned that intuition with that where I have not yet.
Sure.
So that stuff's all weighed differently within that context. So I think with that being said, like you have to be able, like if you're going to like kind of design your process and design, what your framework is for return to play, like I would start in this kind of like stripped down version of how would I MacGyver this with just my eyes, my hands, and a rubber band.
Yep.
And then you can build up to the ideal world of where you have everything. Because if you do it in that direction, you're not going to rely on the data. It's not going to be your master. Like I said, it can be a servant to your process. So the way I think that this data can serve us is by being a kind of check to some things that we might make mistakes on. So like our eyes can be faulty, our judgment systems can be faulty.
Sure.
When I start using data, I start using, things like force plates, or like those spit out numbers that I can't fudge.
Right.
I can't tell myself that it's better. The numbers are going to tell me it's better.
Yeah.
So I think of these things as kind of like, bumpers in our bowling alley lane that, keep us from falling into the gutter. They're going to be a checks and balance. In an ideal world, like I think over time, your coach's eye and the data should start aligning together. What I mean by that is like the way you can test that is like, are you surprised by what the data is telling you? If you're surprised, you might need to go back and reevaluate your process or reevaluate what you're seeing. And it's going to happen for sure. But that should allow you to make your sense making a little more acute and a little more accurate. For sure.
Okay. So we've kind of talked broad. Let's narrow down, because you mentioned track. You and I got to hang out with the Indy 11 some. So we know one of the most prominent injuries in those two sports is hamstring pulls. And I know you're passionate about this and working a lot in this space. So let's start, again, kind of broad here. What are some of like the major risk factors that play into a hamstring pathology? What are the main things that are driving some of this?
This is such a fun conversation, because you start getting into this world where like we can start listing off like the literature of what it says, but honestly that stuff's like kind of boring. So we can jump into this.
It is boring. I've read it. It's not exciting reading for sure.
It's a lot of more to be concluded, more research to be done, right?
Yeah.
So no, this is kind of where I'll touch on some of that stuff and kind of what is, I guess, quote unquote known. But it's kind of fun to dip in this, I guess, theoretical world where we can kind of try to put some of these pieces together and try to understand this web of determinants and how it may influence specifically hamstrings. So from a research standpoint, the things that we start looking at here is like, number one, it's previous injury, just like any injury. Like, and I think particularly for hamstrings, it's the reoccurrence rates are pretty nasty from what you see. So it looks like around 33% of these will reoccur, with most of them happening, with 50% of them, happening within 30 days of the injury. So you look at that thing and you start thinking like, all right, are we returning people too quickly? Is the process not robust enough? Like what's going on here with these strains? So, and it's a big deal because this is a huge money loser for pro sports. This is the second largest injury in American football. It's certainly one of the largest in professional soccer. And then track and field, watching a championship, and you're going to see, guys missing out for major injuries. So for me, this was something where, when I first started working in clinics, like I thought these were pretty easy to treat because I would see like the high school soccer kid and get them back pretty quick. And then when I started working with these elite track and field kids, it's like, oh, like we said with stopwatch sports, like you have no room for error. Like this kid can't run this race at 85, 90%. They're either 100% or they're not. And when the gun goes off, it's that or it's nothing. So you start realizing how little the wiggle room is with some of these high powered individuals. So things you start looking at in conversations you might start having in literature is like surrounding muscle architecture. So you can get in the conversation on like fascicle length. So things we'll see is like people with shorter muscle fascicles seem to have a larger risk of injury. And then on the flip side of that, people after they have these injuries, they seem to present with shorter fascicles. Things we'll additionally see is, stuff like age. We'll see accumulated fatigue. So what is this? How does this acute chronic workload focus into this? And then we kind of get in this black box of mechanics, and do mechanics matter? And you can have some really good arguments with people over that who will be on both sides of that war. And that's an interesting conversation. But and then we can start talking about like positional mechanics. So what's the pelvis doing? How's the thorax interacting? How am I stabilizing? Getting the minutia there. And really how I start sense making all this, and kind of the pattern I started seeing in our track athletes over time was like really this like vicious risk cycle. So like the way I think about this is like just a recurrent loop where you can start anywhere in this, but there's going to be like common mechanical inefficiencies as one piece. There's going to be increased eccentric stress on the muscle, accumulated fatigue, and then increased knee flexion, optimal torque angles. So let's start somewhere on that chain. So let's say we have a runner, and let's say that they have, a sprinter, and let's say their mechanics are less than optimal. We have someone who's overstriding, they're reaching, and now we have someone who's, has less than optimal mechanics. So what we might see in that pattern is we might see increased eccentric stress because they're over lengthening the muscle. Their timing might be off in that process. From there, we start seeing this accumulated stress theory saying, hey, we're pulling on this, or we're over lengthening over and over again. Now we're creating micro trauma. And as we know, eccentric stress can be hell for a muscle, right? And if I'm running repeatedly over and over and don't have time to recover, I might have specific areas of muscle. I might have specific areas that are getting overstressed. And now those things are not able to turn over and adapt to that stress. Now what we start seeing with accumulated fatigue is that the body gets into a protection phase. So we start thinking about the role of the muscle spindle and sensing, hey, there's damage in here. We're overstretching. I'm going to disallow this stress from happening. The muscle spindle sensitivity will go up. And now that lengthening will not be allowed to occur. So what we start seeing is the person actually gets weaker at longer lengths. So the exact area that they need to be strong and be able to resist that stretch, they're no longer able to do it. So now that just further enhances the poor mechanics, the overstriding, and now eventually, boom, something goes. So this might not be just a one stride problem. This is a 10,000, 20,000 stride issue that eventually one of them is just the breaking point.
Right. I'm so glad we're talking about this, because this was my world for so long, thinking back to the time with Indy 11 and, getting guys. We are lucky. I mean, in my entire time there, we had very few hamstring issues, and I don't take credit for that. I think there was a high degree of luck involved in that. But man, I think one of the big things that frustrated me at that point in time was just this very myopic view as to why hamstrings were getting injured. And so I think whenever I saw this kind of stuff, I really tried to help athletes and other clinicians and coaches understand that, like, look, man, if you look at all of the potential issues here, this is a very multifactorial problem we're looking at, right? And you named a bunch of them, right? Whether it's poor pelvic positioning, whether it's poor mechanics, fatigue. I forget all the research now, but in soccer, I think they say over 30 minutes in the first half. So the last 15 minutes of the first half, and then from 60 minutes on. So the 60 to 90 minutes rate of injury goes up. So it's like, look, so many people weren't talking about pelvic position. They weren't talking about fatigue. They were just looking at, like fascicle length and, these very myopic things. So I'm just glad to hear somebody like you talking about, look, man, we have to look at this whole thing, right? And I think a robust return to play process really does look at each one of those and figure out, okay, how much leverage can I pick up turning each one of these knobs? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, like earlier with this web determinant, it's like, what's my entry point? Like, so for certain individuals, like some of these things might not be manipulable. So like you might not be changing someone's mechanics. Like I think with a sprinting athlete, like a lot of times this is essential, especially in youth sprinters. You see a lot of times like, oh, this kid's super fast. He's like, one of the fastest kids in the country at age 14, I don't want to touch his mechanics and slow him down. But it's like,
right.
as we adapt and as we change, as we mature, like what you can get away with at 14 is different than what you can get away with at 18 as the engine grows and as your anthropometrics change. Yeah. So if we're not taking that time to maybe slow down and address things early, like that's where that 17-year-old starts having recurrent issues and can't get over it.
Yeah.
So but on the other end of that, like a basketball player, for instance, like they're not reaching top speed mechanic. So like I might not be spending that much time, trying to change their sprint mechanics. Like, is the translatability really there? Like I'm gonna train, like in a rehab process, I'm gonna train it because I think it's the most efficient way and the safest way for them to build up back to top speed for sure. But am I going to worry so much and lose sleep if they're not transferring that over back to their transition in the court? I might want to see small changes if there's egregious, levels of deviation that I think are putting them at risk. But I'm not going to ask them to be, Usain Bolt, running from rim to rim.
Right. Well, and I feel like I'm not going to make you comment on this based on your position, but there's a specific body type and shape in the NBA that has a tendency to pull hamstrings, right? And if you go and you look at the people that have pulled hamstrings in the last year or two or missed significant time, by and large, there's a pretty standard body shape, body type, movement strategy that you see time and time again. Mm-hmm. So, okay, here's something else I'm really interested in. When we're looking at hamstrings, what specific metrics are you looking at with regards to hamstring health? And maybe as a corollary to that, what negative changes do you see after an injury? Because I'm sure you guys are tracking everything, and you don't have to talk about it from like the Washington Wizards perspective. Just hamstrings in general. What are you looking at with regards to overall health? And then what do you see on the back end when somebody does get hurt? What do we see start to change or deteriorate?
Yeah, from a general health standpoint, like this is where in that when we start talking about risk factor again, and this like before anyone is injured risk assessment, it's difficult. It's really difficult. And that's where you start having to look at overall strategy. So mm-hmm. I think it comes down to kinematic analysis of how the person moves based off of, and based off their individual profile to say, is this something that may be putting them at risk? And it's hard to say because I think the things we might look at to test like strength. So like you look at like NOR boards, like there is some evidence there, but it's tough. It's tough to translate, and the evidence is not clear there. Right. So, and if you start looking at it, it's like, well, if I'm looking at the peak torques on a hamstring at terminal swing phase, they're like 50% higher than what you can produce isometrically.
Exactly.
So we're looking at things that are like 10 times a person's body weight. So it's hard to necessarily equate that isometric level of force to what they're going to be putting in while they're sprinting. Yeah. So I think that at least for me, that's a hard bridge to gap when you start talking about risk assessment. So that's where I think it comes down to, again, understanding that N=1 context, understanding the person's mechanics, understanding their body positioning, understanding how their strategy and how their anthropometrics are putting stress on different areas of their body. And then from there, it's assessing over time. If I'm finding someone who's consistently complaining of hamstring tightness, that's a warning sign for me. And if I start looking at, certain tests like a max hip flexion active knee extension where, we're pushing them into full hip flexion and tracking their knee extension to see the actual excursion of that. If that's changing after stress, after they run, after they play, and it's different side to side and conjoining with their complaints, now I'm getting concerned. If now they're starting to lose strength at length, so now I'm starting to see, they're getting, they're losing strength at longer levers. Now I'm starting to see patterns that are there post-injury that are now showing that we might be in this kind of accumulated fatigue phase that might be putting us at larger risk. So it's kind of an emergent process, I would say, rather than, to me, it's hard to say you're doing a full team assessment preseason and to do anything like, this person's at huge risk for hamstring injury. Like, I think that's, at least for me right now, that's a difficult bridge to gap.
Sure. So is that where you've got I'm assuming you guys probably use multiple tests, right? It's like, okay, well, they're complaining about some things. Then you're maybe doing some of these other tests. Okay, you start to think maybe we've got some accumulated fatigue here. Then maybe you go back and you look at your force plate testing, right? And see if you're starting to see maybe longer ground contact times or something like that? Is that kind of where, again, you can't go, we talked about this up front. You can't just go, there's not one test where you're like, oh, this is going to give me all the information. It's going to tell me exactly what to do. It's like, you got to start to pick up multiple things across multiple tests that let you know, like, maybe this is something I need to be looking out for.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of way my brain goes with this stuff is like, it's hard to like, it's hard to predict what part might break down. Mm-hmm. I think it's easy to understand that there's inefficiencies, there's the cog in the wheel that something might break down.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think it's easier to start seeing that, like, kind of your check engine light pops on. But I'm like, I don't know exactly what that's telling me to check. So that comes down to your, in-depth assessment. So I think when I think about risk assessment or we talk about athlete screening, it's like you got to cast a wide net. And from there, so you have your general tests, you have your general, so coming back to like the principles we talked about earlier, like you have your general tests that are looking to kind of get a look under the hood about how each of those things, like what's their profile for each of those different components. And then from there, based on what you see, I see it as like almost like you double click on that box. Then there's options to start looking at other variables and factors. So each thing might take you a different level down the rabbit hole to have a more and more nuanced evaluation. And from there, a lot of times it's, we're certainly going to start intervening on things. But what I also want to see is like, if I don't know this individual well, I need to start understanding how this stuff, what this means to them over a larger time frame. So how does this change as they start playing games? How does this change how does this affect their strategy? Is this something that's useful for them? If I take this away right now, do they have another leg to stand on or no? So again, it's that N=1 context with N= 10,000 insight. So it's tricky. And like, I know it's frustrating to kind of always give these gray answers, but that's the reality we live in. And I think that's how we have to operate.
Like what you just described is exactly how I describe this to young coaches, to interns that have been in the gym, is like, if you see enough bodies, you can start to pick up inefficiencies, right? Things that you don't love in the context of your movement model. Right? Whether it's a squat, a lunge, a hinge, you can say, these are things that worry me, or maybe even just about their posture and their alignment, right? The way they carry their body relative to the earth. So I will tell people, and I'll tell these coaches, like, look, I can't tell you that they're going to get injured, but I can tell you that, look, there are things here that worry me. And the thing that's scary is, like you alluded to, I don't know what could break down, because that's the N=1 thing, right? You could have 10 people that show up with the exact same body shape, body structure, body position, and one has Achilles pain, 3 have anterior knee pain, 4 have lower back pain, 2 or 3 have hip impingements. It's like, you don't know, but that's where you've got to have the model first. And then again, it comes back to, okay, what is unique about this specific individual? How they bear load, maybe their body structure, things that we can't see. Right? Like, I'm not putting everybody under x-rays to see what their hips look like and all that. That's what gives you some insight is, okay, just on a global scale, this doesn't look exactly the way that I want. Now I need to dig deeper. Like you said, double click that box and say, okay, you've had some knee stuff. Let's double click here. Let's look a little bit deeper into your knees and maybe what could be going on there.
Yeah, for sure. Because every past history leaves a ripple effect. So you got to understand like the constraints on the system, like we talked about before. So I think our job is to identify those things. And again, like that's what our testing is doing. It's finding constraints. So we're trying to alleviate those things to allow the most access and the most options to the individual to express their athleticism. So they're not limited. So at the end of the day, like we said, like the constraints might lead to different problems, but at the end of the day, the constraints, and we need to find ways to increase robustness and find more options for the athlete to solve a problem.
So jumping off from there and bringing this all together to some degree, if you're a coach listening to this and you work with track athletes, basketball players, soccer players, anybody that is at risk for dealing with hamstring issues, what are some boxes you feel like they have to check in their programming to keep the hamstrings healthy?
I think, you got to sprint. Like we talked about before, there's really no other way to replicate the stress on the hamstring than sprinting. And I think, a lot of times we see these issues for people coming into preseason, you'll see it once the NFL training camp starts, you're going to see a ton of these just for perhaps the volume or load or intensity of sprinting is not been there to prepare, because at the end of the day, like there's literature showing, Nordics and overload eccentrics are effective. We could do, fancy stuff like say on Instagram, like our, reflexive eccentrics and, tantrums and all this stuff. And that stuff's great. I have no problem with that stuff. But at the end of the day, like there's nothing that's loading the hamstring like sprinting is doing. Right. And additionally, like I'll be remiss if I don't discuss, like, especially in a sport like basketball, like I think we put hamstring injuries in a bucket that is sprint related. Like there's a lot of change of direction based, lunge based, like torsional based issues you're going to see with hamstrings as well. So that comes down to, challenging position, make sure we're hitting these different buckets in the weight room just to stress tissue appropriately, and then stressing those patterns within the level of intensity of the terminal task prior to stepping into a reactive element on the field. So it's kind of a bailout answer, but it comes down to adequately preparing the tissue and adequately preparing the system to handle the stress you're going to be asking it to do. And again, that comes back to the reverse engineering concept.
So one of the things that I've always tried to impress upon people is that the weight room is a great place to try and stress the body, stress the system, stress the tissues without the chaos of competitive sport. Yeah. Right? Like there's nothing you can do to replicate that, but you can try and, as safely and as effectively as possible, get it as close as possible, and at least expose these athletes to some of the forces and positions they're going to be in on a field, court, pitch, whatever. And so if you can do that, again, we're never going to make it truly sport specific. We all know that. But man, I think the closer you can get it while keeping athletes safe and healthy along the way, the more effective and hopefully the more robust they're going to be as a result.
But absolutely. But like, I will say that the evidence and the talk of eccentric exercise as a focal point certainly does make sense physiologically, especially like there's a really good article by Franz Bosch and Bosvahorn called is there really an eccentric action of the hamstring in sprinting? So it's excellent because there's some debate on this, but I think the model is really helpful to understand some of this nuance here. So basically what they get into is essentially talking about how in efficient sprinting, there likely isn't actual true lengthening of the muscle fascicle until the entire musculotendinous unit lengthens 79% of its full capacity. So we have we have the non-contractile elements in the muscle. So we have the series elastic element, the parallel elastic component, in the series that are going to extend before the fascicle actually has to. If you think about it, that's a really smart way for the body to do it. You're utilizing your free non-contractile energy, right? Yeah. Kind of that rubber band effect. And then once you get past that point, now it's like, oh, we're getting to our end range. We need to actually contract this muscle to control position. Right. So if you look at sprinting, and if we're hitting those positions, we're not overstriding, we're having good sequencing and timing in our terminal swing to downstroke, we're probably not hitting that 79%. However, what you start looking at is like, if that fascicle starts to lengthen, if I have a shorter fascicle, I have less of a buffer zone before an injury happens. I run out of space faster. Right. So when we start talking about the benefit of Nordics or just heavily loaded eccentric exercise overall, is like we seem to find that is actually increasing fascicle length. So that certainly theoretically makes sense for it to be protective, because it's going to provide that physiological buffer zone from us. If we have that overstride moment or our sprinting is less efficient, it's giving us protection and give us the ability to manage that. And again, like if we have robustness in that position, then ideally the muscle spindle sensitivity is down to the point where we're not losing strength at length. We're maintaining strength at length to be able to control those positions. So again, it might not be something you have to rely on all the time, but it becomes that emergency brake for that oh crap moment where the injury might occur. So that's the way I think about that. But again, sprinting is going to kind of groove everything, and it's going to drive the neurology, and it's going to change the architecture as well. Yep. But I think a way we can support that in the weight room is certainly with eccentric exercise. And like we mentioned before, focusing on position, focusing on, how the pelvis integrates, how the thorax integrates, because at the end of the day, like, we start thinking about the way tendons will attach, and this is something Bill pointed out to me, like, most tendons will attach in a spiral formation rather than just being a straight input to the. So if we start thinking about that, there's going to be a winding and unwinding element when I get in and out of position. So if I'm not controlling pressure well, if I'm not starting from a good position and I can't wind and unwind, we start thinking about this tendon being something that's getting wrung out like a towel.
Yep.
So, and then it can't unwind and fill back up. And that, what we're talking about filling up with is blood and oxygen, right? So over time, if I can't reoxygenate that tissue and I keep wringing it out over time and keeping that pressure on it, like, that thing's going to get brittle and break. So we start talking about that process for like a tendinopathy. If I start having chronic tendon, and at the end of the day, the attachment point of the hamstring, and where most of these injuries occur, is right in the musculotendinous junction. So the tendon health is imperative here. So it's something we got to think about big picture as well. So, and again, that's all going to be N=1. There's no kind of cookie cutter solution to why that's happening for somebody. So it's something that you just have to dive into with each of the individuals in front of you.
I love it. Okay. Quick topic change, and then we'll start to wrap up. I want to talk about some career stuff because you've had an interesting career. I know this is something you think a lot about. So for starters, I want to talk about moving from the private sector to pro sports. And for starters, because again, a lot of people listen to this and they're like, yeah, I'd love to work in pro sports. What changes does that make to your lifestyle?
Oh, it's crazy. Like, they can call my wife if they want to hear more about that. No, it's a complete flip of lifestyle. And that's something that, something I really appreciated when I was investigating going into this opportunity, is it almost felt like everybody I talked to who'd been in that realm was trying to talk me out of it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I found myself doing the same thing to other individuals I've talked to, because they're not doing that to try to scare you. They're not doing that, but like, I think it's unfair if you don't understand what the realities of the position is and the sacrifices you have to make to do it. There's so many upsides. There's so much great stuff, but like, you can't really coordinate life as a normal human being during season. Like, you're working 7 days a week. You're working well over 40 hours a week. You're working, at odd hours. You're on airplanes a ton. You're living in hotel rooms. Like, for us, like, our travel schedule was crazy to the point where I believe between December and January, we were on the road 40 out of 60 days for those 2 months.
Oh my gosh.
So it's something where,
that's wild.
Yeah, it becomes just, for that part of season, it just becomes life, and something you have to manage, and something you have to understand if is at this point of my life I'm in, at the point of my career, and is this something that I'm willing to do? And again, there's so many positives to it. There's so much great stuff from it, but I think it's imperative to understand what that does for a lifestyle, for sure. Yeah.
I think that's very helpful because while I've never seriously entertained the thought, I've had similar discussions where people, obviously I know a lot of people like you, and I love having these kinds of discussions, and I love learning, like, what is life like in your world? And man, I can't tell you how many times people, without even me asking, they're just like, yeah, don't do it. Don't do it. And not that it's not a great opportunity or not something that would be professionally beneficial, but just they know my lifestyle. They know, like, the family piece for me is very important, and they're like, just don't even think about it. Like, it's not worth it for you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's where it comes down to just identifying, like, yeah, what do you want? What is right for you at this phase of your career and phase of your life? And does this fit? And am I willing to do this? So, and if if that stuff all lines up, like, it's, like I said, it's awesome. It's excellent. It affords so many things.
Yes. I love it. Okay. So, kind of along those same lines, you and I are both passionate about learning. We love learning new things. We love being around, like, really, like, active, vibrant thinkers. So I'm interested, like, what are you learning about right now, man? And what made you decide to focus on the areas that you're working on right now?
Sure. So I feel like I always have to, like, catch myself, because I'm I'll start chasing different rabbits as I go. I get very distracted. And so during season, a lot of times I find myself studying things that are immediately actionable. I'm trying to solve immediate problems. Yes. So it almost becomes my in season. I'm needing to execute. I'm needing to find things right now. I'm needing to solve problems that I need to face tomorrow. So as I transition to off season, it's kind of like a time I can take a breath and say, what are my weak points right now? What are my constraints? So I try to do an audit at the end of the year to say, my performance this year, what things did I run into that I didn't understand as well as I needed to? Where did I not execute? What areas are my rate limiting steps to not having the same problems next year? So, and then I try to periodize that over the course of the off season. So for me right now, it's a point where I can kind of just enjoy learning again. I can kind of find and chase things that are interesting to me. So like I'm kind of doing something where I'm going back and trying to start really small to build back up again. So I'm looking at more stuff, I guess, on a cellular level, trying to understand fascia, trying to understand mechanisms of manual therapy and how things are affected there. I'm reading a book on acupuncture right now because that's connecting some dots for me on things. So I'm kind of hitting some different points to try to understand some more of the granular elements to help me make sense of discrepancies between other models. A lot of my job is a lot of the demands of my job that are different than what they were in outpatient is I do a lot more manual therapy now than I did before. So a lot of my study and time is focused on building that skill set. I think building my framework for how that fits into my movement framework and my overall return to play and just rehab framework. So I'm doing a lot of work to try to sense make for that, I would say.
Gotcha. It's interesting. I feel like I don't know if it's every couple of years, maybe it's every 5, 10, I don't know, probably mileage will vary depending on the person, but I think there's a lot of value in constantly revisiting your foundation and kind of rebuilding it from the ground up, right? Like going back to like your base level anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, like going back to that foundational stuff, because I'm sure you've heard the quote at some point, like you'll never read the same book twice, right? Like you read a book once and you're at a certain place in your life and you read that same book 5 years later and it's like reading it through different eyes, right? Because you've changed and you evolved. And I think the same thing happens when it comes to training and rehabilitation. Like the longer you do this, it helps you to go back and kind of relearn some of the foundational things and things that you maybe take for granted. Now you look at it through a different lens when you do things like that.
100%. I think that's a really good way of putting together what I'm trying to do right now. And like, I'm not really looking at new materials and looking at stuff I've looked at before. And it's funny, I'm finding things that didn't resonate with me before are kind of making sense, and pieces that I felt like were disagreeing with each other. If you start going a couple layers deeper, you start finding the link between those two things at a more granular level. So that's been kind of fun to just kind of, I guess, chase those rabbits right now. And as I get closer to season, I'll start trying to make that stuff less and less general and more specific to where, how I need to execute during the year. So it's kind of funny. You do kind of organize it like a off-season training plan, I suppose, general to specific.
Bill and I always say that it's like everything can come back and be related to training somehow,
for sure.
Right? Somehow you can always relate it back to training.
For sure.
Okay, man, big question time. If you could alter the space-time continuum and give young Anthony Iannarino one piece of advice, what would it be?
Don't skip steps. I think it comes back to the theme of what we're talking about. Like, I think a lot of times, like in my career, being around, really smart, really successful people, you kind of look at things like, oh, like I can hack this thing, or I can, I don't need to go through this part of the process because I think I understand this a little bit better. Or I think I'm smart enough to not have to do this. And like every time I've done that, it's coming back and just killed me. Like if I could find clear examples of like, me not spending as much time on this elemental thing, like, I really failed. I failed at this process. I messed this up. I embarrassed myself here. So it's like, I think life is a great teacher in the sense that it kind of, shows you up on those things. So I don't know if I'd listen to that advice because I think I'd probably do the same thing. And I don't know if I'd actually change that because I think it works out in its own way. But like, that's what I would say is the process for a reason. You just got to go through it and be patient and take your knocks and do it.
For sure. Okay. Last but not least, lightning round. 4 fairly short questions. Your answer can be as long or short as you like.
Let's get it.
Number 1, can't wait for this. Dude, talk to me about the family pizza shop.
So this is my really like other life here. Like, so I have grown up around, so my family has owned a small carry-out only pizza shop in the north end of Columbus. It's been in our family since my grandpa started in 1959.
That's
so
awesome.
I grew up around my grandpa running it, my dad running the shop. And then I've gotten more hands-on as my dad's moving on to retire. So I've been fortunate to be able to kind of help things behind the scenes and keep things going, keep things in the family, with some great partners back in Columbus to keep the shop going. So I'm really passionate about just kind of telling the story about the shop. It's, small shop, simple pizza, but it's so good. I think it's something where I've learned a lot of lessons just by watching my dad interact, my grandpa interact with clients, and just how you take something that's simple, you don't change it, you don't cheapen the product, and you have long-term success within that. So it's been a great model for, I guess, how to do things for me, and excited to kind of can see that growing. So the shop's called Territa's Pizza.
All right, dude, I'm going to have to try it out.
Sure.
I don't go to Columbus all the time, but I'm going to have to try it out. Okay, so this is like what we were just talking about. Number 2, what parallels are there between pizza and physical prep?
So what I just said, like my grandpa and my dad have always just said one thing when you ask. They said, don't cheapen the product and don't change anything. So what I take from that is, like, when I was a kid, like, you're hanging around the shop and you're looking at, like, you look at the menu and you're like, why aren't we adding, like, this kind of pizza, or why aren't we putting this topic on it? Like, just thinking, and like my dad would just like look at me and shake his head. And it's like, you realize, like, no, you are, like, you're where you're at because of what you do well.
Right.
And you need to keep things simple, and you need to really lean in on what your strengths are. And like, as a pizza shop, like, we use high quality ingredients. So we haven't changed that throughout the years. We're known for the sausage that we make. We homemade the sausage. The sausage is homemade, and it's amazing. It's so good. So you lean into those strengths, and people are going to love you and identify for those things. And you don't change it. You stay consistent. You deliver the same product, and things are going to work out for you over, as you see, that since 1959, we've been doing well in Columbus, and have been lucky to be voted best pizza in Columbus a couple of years.
That's awesome.
Be recognized on the national level in some publications. So it's cool to see that from such a small shop to kind of get that recognition for just being consistent and doing the same stuff. I watched my dad, my whole life, just be a model of consistency.
Right.
I don't know, have you ever seen the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a Joe Ken favorite right there.
Oh yeah. So like, I think that's great. It's like one of those things where I take that from my career. It's like, when you're lucky enough to find something that you're passionate about for a job, rather than, just having to grind out 40 hours a week, when it's something that, you love talking about, you love reading about on your off time. And like, I think what you owe back for that is to give everything you can to try to master your craft and push it as far as you can and push the field forward. So I think that's what I took out of Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And that's what I see in the pizza shop is, when you have something like that, you owe it to the craft to just be as close to perfect as you can be for what you are offering and what the consumer wants from you. Yeah.
Dude, I'm going to link that in the show notes. If you haven't watched that documentary,
it's awesome.
Every trainer should watch it. And just like the level of precision, the level of excellence that they try and hold themselves to is amazing. And I mean, look, I don't know how old the documentary is, but this dude was 85, still killing it in the sushi game. His son was his understudy, and his son was like 50, right? Could you imagine being 50 and still being your dad's understudy? Like, I mean, that's crazy. So it was cool. It's cool. I'll make sure I link it in the show notes.
For sure. Must watch.
Must watch. Number 3, I heard a rumor you're working on a course. I want to hear about it. How's the course coming along? Yeah,
so like something I'm really happy that I was able to continue to do as I transitioned to the Wizards is we started a continuing education company through Rehab Reform a couple years ago. So me and a couple colleagues did that, and for me, teaching is an excellent way to help consolidate information in my head, and I think a way to pay forward. So for me, it's something where I've learned from a lot of great people. I think all of us who helped run R2P Academy have done the same thing. So being able to take this information and put it in a way that I think is digestible, and honestly what I wish I would have had when I started the process of trying to learn the things I'm learning, that's really what we're looking to do. So talking about hamstrings today, that's a course that me and a colleague, Greg Ellis, have been putting together. So we're putting the finishing touches on our comprehensive hamstring strain rehab program that we're going to be releasing online. So
nice.
Really excited for that. A lot of the elements we talked about today, and then a lot more tactical and practical tips to kind of addressing and how to conceptualize these things. So in addition to that, we're going to be releasing, we do an in-person course as well called the Blueprints. And we're going to be doing a level 2 course later this summer. So we're starting to construct that and lay that out. We're going to take a lot of this, some of those like principles we talked about and some of the big tactical elements that I addressed today and start putting them to more practical pieces and address things like hamstring, address things like ACL, address overhead athlete to try to give a more practical case study based interpretation of these things. Because I think a lot of times you go to courses and it's like, how do I put this together? How do I put this in?
Yeah.
So we're trying to, because that was our favorite part of those courses, is having this conversation. So spend more time on that and really allow the people at the course to drive conversation, solve problems together, and leave the course in a better place going forward.
Man, I love those kinds of courses.
For sure.
And I'm super biased. You've been in the intensive, right?
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Yeah. Bill's intensive. I try and do that at my complete coach seminars where it's very open-ended. Certain things, certain boxes I want to check, but let's answer your questions and let's try and dive into some of the issues that you're having and struggling with. And it's cool to see. I mean, look, I don't think any of us enjoyed COVID and the pandemic and all that, but going into our caves for a couple years and doing everything on Zoom, I think people are a lot more excited now to go back out. And the model has really changed. It's not so much, let's cram 200, 300, 400 people in a room. It's, hey, let's get, 8 in Bill's case or 20 in mine or whatever size your course is going to be. Let's do it smaller. Let's be way more hands-on, way more like interactive. And I think ultimately it's more pleasurable for me as a presenter. And it's way more educational for the attendees when you do it like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the silver linings of COVID and of online learning is that these kind of hybrid models of learning should allow us to expedite some of the procedural learning you need to do, some of the kind of PowerPoint droning, lecture-based stuff. Like, I think when you can provide that stuff online or provide access to the foundation of that online, it allows you to get to that stuff quicker. Like we talked about, that interactive element, that more deeper learning, connection-based, real world application conversation that I think we've really been missing throughout COVID. So I think there certainly is a benefit to that as well.
Agreed. All right, man. Last but not least, what's next for Anthony Iannarino, man? Off season. Are you looking forward to Vegas? Do you have to do the Vegas thing in July?
Yeah. So go to Summer League, which is always a
Summer League grind.
Always a good time, man. Always a good time in Summer League. I think any more than 3 days in Vegas is too many, but we find a way to make 2 weeks work over Summer League. So no, it's a guy. Last year was my first time, so I'm looking forward to going back again. It's nice because there's a lot of familiar faces around the NBA, new people you get to meet, and then it's a good atmosphere around Summer League. For sure.
That was the best part about going last year, man. I was there for 2 days, got to see some people, shake some hands, and then on Monday morning, I'm out, bro. I've had enough Vegas. I didn't see a vegetable for a day and a half, I don't think so.
That is definitely the way to experience Summer League for sure. But
man,
I'm definitely looking forward to it. No, so what's next for me? I wish I knew, man. I think every time I've tried to plan what my career is going to look like or life's going to look like, something's kind of hit me in the head and surprised me. So at this point, I think it's kind of like we talked about, Jira Gyms of Sushi. I'm just trying to get better every day, trying to take a step towards, those elements of mastery and try to focus on the small elements in front of me and kind of be flexible and see where things take me. So I feel more than blessed and fortunate to be in the situation I am. So it would be selfish of me to want for more. So I'm just trying to, be the best I can for the people around me, be the best I can for my family, and continue just trying to grow and enjoy.
Yeah. Respect, man. Respect what you're doing. Happy to see you where you're at, dude. Where can my people find out more about you? How can they learn more about you and all the great work that you're doing? For
sure. You can check out, I'm at Instagram. I'm not crazy active in there. I'm hoping to be more during the off season. It's Iannarino, spelled IANNARINO _DPT or 3_DPT. And then you can find me there. And then you could find what we're doing with R2P Academy at R2P Academy is our Instagram handle, or r2pacademy.com. So yeah, shoot me a DM. I'm always responsive, happy to follow up on anything, answer any questions, have any discussions for anybody looking to kind of go into more from this podcast. So happy to pay things forward, happy to help. So please reach out.
I love it. Well, Anthony, man, thanks again for coming on, brother. This was really great.
Absolutely. Again, honor to be here, and I really appreciate your time and bringing me on here.